You guys, have you experienced pain at the front of your hip when you're squatting? I know I certainly have. And here's the thing, most people assume or are just told, oh, it's those darn hip flexors, they're tight, just stretch them, it'll get better, right? But the truth is, it often comes down to the hip joint itself. The squat involves the hip internally and externally rotating, in addition to hip flexion. So if you're limited in hip internal or external rotation, it's most likely going to be the case that you struggle with getting down deep in your squat and may experience pain at the front of the hip because the hip or that femur isn't clearing the hip correctly due to your lack of mobility in the hip joint. So today, let's break it down. I'm going to teach you guys how to assess your hip mobility, range of motion, strength, flexibility, so we can kind of help you narrow down what may be causing your hip pain. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a solution as to how you can squat pain-free again. You can assess your hip range of motion by yourself without any help. It's actually pretty easy. Just lie on your back, and then you're going to bring one leg up with it bent, grab onto the knee here, and then pull that knee in toward your chest. And see if you have plenty of flexion range of motion. Normal is around 110, 120 degrees. So if this is 90, 100, 110, 120. See if you have enough flexion range of motion. If you don't, then that could be the problem. But it's often the case that most of us do have plenty of flexion, and that's not the problem at all, nor are those hip flexors, right? So now let's assess hip internal rotation. For this one, I want you to place one hand on the knee and one hand over on the shin region if you can reach it, okay? Or on the calf, and then you're gonna pull the foot outward, okay? So we're starting at 0 degrees and we're going out with the foot, and you should have 35, 45 degrees of internal rotation here. All right, check it on both legs here. See how your flexion is, see how that internal rotation is. And if you feel like you don't have at least 35 degrees of internal rotation, then that may be something that you need to work on. And lastly, external rotation. You're gonna grab the knee with one hand and then grab the ankle with the other hand. This time you're gonna pull the foot inward instead of outward. And for external rotation, you should have at least 45 degrees, but most people have even more, even up to 70, 80, some people 90 degrees here, okay? So do that on both legs and see if you have restricted range of motion in external rotation for any of these. So now you can narrow down, okay, if I'm limited in internal rotation, I need to do some internal rotation mobility exercises for the hip. Or if you're limited in external rotation on one leg, then do some external rotation exercises on that side so that you can kind of balance things out and have equal range on both legs. Because the issue is when we don't have enough mobility on one hip, then we have to compensate. We start to shift all of our weight onto the hip that does have the range of motion. It causes just even more muscle imbalance issues. As a physical therapist, I'd also do some muscle length testing, which just means testing flexibilities for certain muscles around the hips and the legs. All right, now let's also test strength of our hip internal and external rotators. All right, so I want you to lie on your stomach and place one leg out like this. Now, to test the internal rotators, lift your foot off the ground. Can you do that? If you can't do that, then the internal rotators are weak and you need to work on strengthening them. Now to test hip external rotation, you could do some banded clamshells on your side and see how many max reps you can do on each side to compare and see if possibly one side is weaker than the other. All right, you guys, so one more explanation here. When you go down into a squat, if the hips were to stay neutral and not rotate internally or externally, it would maybe look like this, right? But normally when we squat, we need a wider stance, a bigger base of support. This is where we're stronger. And when we go into our squat, look what happens. We need some external rotation here. And if we don't have it, let's say I don't have much on my right side, so I can't keep my knee pushed out here. This is what happens. And then that femur, the head of the femur, is going to kind of rub in the base of the acetabulum of that pelvic region here. It's gonna rub on it. It's not gonna clear as easily if we don't have full external rotation. So it's very important to have plenty of internal and external rotation for your squat. So once you've tested a few things out, what do you do with that? If you find that you're weak in a certain muscle group, you need to strengthen it. Focus on isolation exercises to strengthen it. If you find that you have limited range of motion in a certain direction, you need to work on range of motion mobility exercises for that. And if you find that you're tight with certain muscles, you need to work on stretching those muscles. The hip flexors flex the hips, so they're being shortened when you squat, and they're being lengthened when you come back up to standing. So to say that when you squat and they're being shortened, if you're tight in them, it doesn't really matter because they're being shortened right now anyways. So having tight hip flexors isn't the answer to why you can't squat pain-free and you have that pain in the front of your hips. So let's stop picking on the hip flexors, you guys. Start to really break things down, focusing on what's truly causing the pain. If you address the true cause of the pain instead of just stretch those hip flexors, you might actually see some results and begin to squat pain-free again.